the Galactic Military Academy's most advanced combat simulation, had never been passed without full environmental armor. But Professor Julia Cook was unbuttoning her cardigan while stepping into the death chamber. "Stop! Emergency Protocol Alpha 7. Commander Zillax's voice cracked across 3 octaves as his claws slammed the warning klaxon. The reinforced viewing chamber erupted in chaos as every alien cadet pressed against the blast-proof windows, watching the small human woman casually remove her sweater like she was entering a particularly warm lecture hall. "Sir, atmospheric composition is reading 93% sulfur dioxide with trace amounts of..." Cadet Kael'thas's voice died as Julia stepped fully into the trial chamber, folding her cardigan neatly over her arm. "I know what it's reading." Zillax's mandibles clicked frantically as he activated every emergency system simultaneously. "Get her out of there. The atmospheric pressure alone should have crushed her respiratory system." Through the observation window, Julia looked around the swirling orange death fog with the mild interest of someone examining a new classroom. She adjusted her reading glasses and pulled a stack of student papers from her bag, completely ignoring the fact that the air around her was literally dissolving the metal floor plates. "Commander," Professor Azila whispered, her violet skin paling to an unhealthy lavender. "The radiation readings are climbing past the threshold for molecular breakdown. How is she still intact?" Julia had apparently found something worth her attention. She was reading one of her student papers, occasionally making small sounds of academic consideration, while toxic clouds billowed around her like a gentle spring breeze. The temperature gauge screamed warnings as it climbed past the melting point of the Academy's strongest armor alloys. "Martinez," Zillax roared through the communication system. "You need to evacuate immediately. The environmental conditions exceed..." "Oh, hello there." Julia looked up from her grating with a pleasant smile, apparently just noticing the frantic aliens pressed against the viewing window. "Sorry. I was just reviewing young Thelonius's essay on pastoral themes in Wordsworth." Fascinating interpretation, though his thesis statement needs work. The silence in the observation deck was broken only by the sound of Cadet Kael'thas fainting. "Professor Cook," Azila managed, her voice strangled with academic confusion. "You are currently experiencing atmospheric conditions that would kill any known species in the galaxy within 30 seconds of exposure. The trial you've just entered is designed to test the absolute limits of our most advanced environmental protection systems." "Oh, this?" Julia gestured vaguely at the roiling clouds of death surrounding her. "It's quite pleasant, actually. Reminds me of Pittsburgh in July." She flipped to the next paper in her stack. "Though I have to say, this humidity is doing wonders for my sinuses." Zillax's claws were leaving permanent grooves in his control console. "The humidity is liquefied metal vapor." "Well, that explains why my hair isn't frizzing today." Julia made a small correction mark on the paper with her red pen, which should have dissolved 3 paragraphs ago. "I don't suppose you have a chair in here? I prefer to grade sitting down." The environmental sensors chose that moment to recalibrate themselves, apparently convinced they were malfunctioning. The new readings made every alien in the observation deck take an involuntary step backward from the reinforced windows. "This is impossible," Azila breathed. "According to every law of biology, physics, and common sense, she should be a puddle of dissolved organic matter by now." Julia looked up from her grating with the patient expression every professor reserves for particularly slow students. "I'm sorry. Did you say something about biology? Because I have to tell you, your atmospheric analysis is a bit dramatic." This is barely worse than Los Angeles during wildfire season. That was when every emergency alarm in the academy began screaming at once. Sir, we have a priority 1 emergency communication from High Command. Kael'thas reported, having recovered consciousness just in time to witness his professor calmly discussing the merits of iambic pentameter while standing in what was essentially weaponized atmosphere. Tell them we're a bit busy with an impossible situation. Zilak snarled, then activated the trial chamber's speaker system again. Professor Cook, I am ordering you to evacuate that chamber immediately. The environmental conditions are... Oh, you mean because of the heat? Julia had removed her blazer now, draping it carefully over her cardigan. Underneath, she wore a simple blouse that should have been atomized by the corrosive atmosphere. Instead, she looked like she was enjoying a warm summer day. I have to admit, this is quite comfortable. Much better than that dreadful air conditioning in the faculty lounge. The temperature readings climbed past the theoretical maximum for organic survival. Julia began rolling up her sleeves. This is beyond impossible, Azila whispered, her academic worldview cracking like poorly mixed concrete. Every principle of environmental biology, every law governing species adaptation, she's violating fundamental rules of existence. Maybe the sensors are malfunctioning, Kael'thas suggested weakly. In response, Zealax activated the chamber's most extreme protocols. The atmospheric composition shifted to pure corrosive compounds. The temperature spiked. Radiation flooded the chamber at levels that would sterilize entire planets. Julia looked around with mild interest, then began organizing her papers more efficiently. You know, this lighting is actually perfect for grading. Very even distribution. You should consider this setup for the library. The lighting is ionizing. Radiation. Is it? Well, that explains why I can see the pencil marks so clearly. She held up a paper to examine it better, squinting slightly. Though I really should have brought my distance glasses for this. Zilax felt something crack inside his mind. Not physically, but the clean breaking sound of assumptions that had supported his entire understanding of reality. How are you alive? Alive? Julia blinked at him through the swirling chaos of superheated death. Of course I'm alive. Why would you think otherwise? She paused thoughtfully. Though, I have to say, this atmosphere does remind me of my graduate advisor's office. Professor Henderson always kept things a bit too warm and stuffy. The environmental controls, apparently taking this as a challenge, pushed conditions to theoretical maximum lethality. The chamber now contained an atmosphere that could dissolve starship hulls. Julia fanned herself with one of the student papers. Could we perhaps get a bit of circulation in here? It's getting a tad close. She just asked for better ventilation. Kael'thas said in the tone of someone watching the universe reorganize itself around principles he'd never considered. In an atmosphere that would melt our strongest battle armor. Priority communication from General Vex Thul. The communication console erupted with the authority-heavy voice of Academy Command. Commander Zilax, report your status immediately. Zilax stared at Julia, who had now settled cross-legged on the floor and was apparently enjoying herself tremendously while grading papers in conditions that violated several treaties governing weapons of mass destruction. Sir, we have a human in the Omega-class environmental trial, and she's comfortable. The silence from the communication channel stretched long enough for Julia to finish correcting an essay on metaphysical poetry and move on to the next paper. Did you say comfortable, Commander? Sir, she asked for better air circulation. Another silence, during which Julia made encouraging comments about a student's analysis of Emily Dickinson. "I'm en route." General Vex Thule arrived with a full scientific analysis team, and the expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality was being systematically demolished by a literature professor in a cardigan. "Show me," he commanded, his four eyes taking in the impossible readings on every environmental monitor. Through the observation window, Julia had apparently found something particularly amusing in her student's work. She was chuckling softly while making notes in the margin, completely oblivious to the fact that she was sitting in what could generously be described as liquid death with atmospheric pretensions. "The human has been in there for 43 minutes, Zilax reported. "Environmental conditions exceed maximum lethality parameters by factors we don't have mathematics to calculate." "And she's grading papers," added Azila, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose life's work had just been revealed as fundamentally incorrect. Dr. Sin Ara, the Academy's chief xenobiologist, was frantically running calculations on her portable analysis unit. "Sir, according to every model we have for organic survival, she should have achieved molecular dissolution within the first 30 seconds of exposure. The radiation alone should have—" "I can see what it should have done," Vex Thule interrupted grimly. "What I want to know is why it didn't." Julia chose that moment to stand up, stretching slightly as if she'd been sitting too long in a particularly comfortable chair. The motion sent waves of lethal atmosphere swirling around her like a gentle breeze. "Oh, hello." She waved cheerfully at the growing crowd of observers. "I don't suppose you could bring me some tea? All this grading is making me a bit thirsty." "She wants tea," Kael'thas said numbly, "in an atmosphere composed primarily of concentrated death." Vex Thule activated the communication system personally. "Professor Cook, this is General Vex Thule of Galactic Military Command. You are currently in extreme mortal danger. Our most advanced environmental suits can only protect against these conditions for minutes, and you've been exposed for nearly an hour." Julia looked up from her papers with the politely puzzled expression of someone dealing with unnecessarily complex bureaucracy. "Oh, I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion. This isn't really extreme at all. It's actually quite pleasant. Reminds me of summer vacation in Phoenix. The atmospheric composition is 97% corrosive compounds that dissolve molecular bonds," Dr. Sinara called out desperately. "Is it?" Julia examined the air around her with new interest, as if seeing it for the first time. "Well, that's fascinating. It must be a different type of corrosive compound than what we get on Earth. This is much more pleasant than our standard variety." The scientists exchanged looks that spoke volumes about the fundamental inadequacy of their understanding of basic chemistry. "Professor," Vex Thule tried again, his voice carrying the careful patience of someone explaining something to a potentially unstable explosive device. "Our instruments indicate that the environmental conditions in that chamber would kill any known life form in the galaxy. How are you surviving?" "Surviving?" Julia tilted her head thoughtfully. "I suppose I've never really thought about it. Though I have to say, this does remind me of my childhood in Houston. Same sort of thick, warm air." She gestured around the chamber of death with her red grading pen, though the humidity here is much more manageable. "The humidity is vaporized plutonium compounds." "Well, that explains why my allergies aren't acting up." Dr. Sinara's analysis unit began making sounds that suggested it was having an existential crisis. "General, every reading confirms that she should be experiencing immediate cellular breakdown. The radiation exposure alone exceeds our scales of measurement." "Maybe," suggested Azila weakly. Maybe humans are different than we thought? Julia had returned to her grading, but looked up at this comment. Oh, are you studying comparative biology? I actually did some interdisciplinary work on that during my sabbatical. Fascinating field, though I found most of the research focused too heavily on theoretical limitations rather than practical adaptation. She held up one of her student papers. Rather like young Morrison here. Excellent analysis of romantic nature imagery. But he keeps insisting that Wordsworth's relationship with the natural world was impossible to maintain in harsh environments. Completely missing the point that harsh environments are where the most interesting relationships develop. The irony was not lost on anyone in the observation deck. Professor Cook, Vexthul said carefully, could you perhaps explain how you're able to function in these conditions? Function? Julia looked around the chamber again, then back at her papers. I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm just grading essays. Though I have to say, this environment is quite conducive to focused work. Very few distractions. Sir, emergency communication from the Galactic Science Council, Kael'thas reported, his voice carrying the shell-shocked tone of someone whose reality had been fundamentally reorganized. They're demanding immediate data on the human environmental anomaly. Julia had finished her stack of papers and was now stretching, apparently working out a small crick in her neck from sitting too long in the apocalyptic death chamber. You know, this has been lovely, but I do have a faculty meeting in about an hour. Something about updating the curriculum for next semester. Don't move, Vexthul barked, then immediately softened his tone. I mean, if you would, please remain where you are for just a few more minutes. We're trying to understand. Oh, certainly. Julia settled back down, pulling out a thermos from her bag. I brought some coffee anyway. Would anyone like some? It's just the regular faculty lounge blend. But it's better than nothing. She unscrewed the cap, and the scent of perfectly normal earth coffee somehow managed to permeate through an atmosphere that should have dissolved her nervous system before her olfactory receptors could function. Professor Cook, Dr. Sonara said carefully, approaching her analysis unit like it might explode. Could you tell us about the environmental conditions on your home planet? Earth? Julia poured herself a cup of coffee with the casual ease of someone at a picnic. Well, let's see. We've got temperature variations from about -40 to +55 Celsius, depending on location and season. Atmospheric pressure varies with altitude and weather patterns. Humidity can range from desert dry to tropical saturation. Oh, and we get fairly regular exposure to solar radiation, cosmic radiation, and occasional atmospheric electrical discharge events. The scientists stared at her. You call those lightning storms, she added helpfully. Plus, there's the general atmospheric composition, about 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and various trace gases including carbon dioxide, argon, and whatnot. Pretty standard stuff. Standard, Vexthul repeated slowly. Well, yes. I mean, every human grows up in it. Julia sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Though I suppose if you're from a different planet, it might seem unusual. What are conditions like on your homeworld? Azila answered automatically, still staring at the readings. Atmospheric pressure maintained at exactly 1.3 standard units, temperature regulated to 23.7 degrees Celsius, humidity at precisely 42%, with full atmospheric filtering to eliminate all potentially harmful compounds. Oh, Julia nodded politely. That sounds very controlled. Our homeworld is a paradise of perfect environmental stability. Dr. Sinara said, with what might have been pride or might have been growing horror. We eliminated all environmental hazards generations ago. How nice for you. Julia's tone carried the diplomatic politeness of someone who found such perfection mildly concerning. Though I imagine it might get a bit predictable. Predictable, Kael'thas echoed hollowly. Professor Cook, Vexthul said, his voice carrying the weight of dawning realization. What you're describing as standard environmental conditions on Earth, those would be classified as extreme survival challenges by our military standards. Julia blinked in surprise. Really? But everyone lives in them. Children play outside in them. My grandmother used to garden in conditions much worse than this. She gestured around the chamber that was still registering as immediately lethal to all known life forms. Your grandmother, Dr. Sinara said faintly, gardened in worse conditions than our most extreme military survival trial? Well, yes. She lived in Minnesota. Julia said this as if it explained everything. Have you ever experienced a Minnesota winter? This is practically tropical in comparison. The silence stretched until Vexthul finally spoke, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose entire military doctrine was crumbling around him. Professor Cook, what we've designed as our ultimate test of environmental survival, this is normal weather on your planet? Normal? Julia considered this. Well, this is actually quite pleasant. A bit warm, but the air quality is surprisingly good. Much better than Los Angeles during smog season, or Houston in August, or really any major city during rush hour. She paused thoughtfully. Though it does remind me a bit of that time I visited Yellowstone. All those geothermal features create a similar atmospheric composition. She's been vacationing in environments that exceed our military survival parameters, Azila whispered. What we've designed is torture, added Zilax. She calls a pleasant spring day. Julia looked around the observation deck with growing concern. I hope I haven't caused any problems. If this is some sort of important test, I can certainly step out. No! Every alien in the room shouted simultaneously. That is, Vexthul said more calmly, we'd very much like to understand how you're able to remain comfortable in these conditions. Comfortable? Julia shrugged. I suppose it's just what you're used to. Humans adapt to whatever environment they're in. It's what we do. She sipped her coffee again. Though, I have to say, this setup would be perfect for certain types of research. The environmental consistency is remarkable. Much better than trying to work outdoors on Earth, where you're constantly dealing with weather changes. The observation deck fell silent as every alien present contemplated the implications of a species that considered their ultimate survival trial to be remarkably consistent environmental conditions. 3 weeks later, Professor Julia Cook was back in her regular classroom, leading a discussion on resilience themes in romantic poetry. The only difference was that Commander Zilax now sat in the back row, frantically taking notes. As we can see in Wordsworth's treatment of the natural world, Julia explained, gesturing to the whiteboard where she'd written out several stanzas, the relationship between human consciousness and environmental challenge creates opportunities for growth that simply can't exist in controlled conditions. Zilax raised his hand. Professor, when Wordsworth describes the mighty world of eye and ear, is he referring to sensory adaptation under environmental stress? Excellent question. Julia smiled approvingly. He's exploring how human perception expands when challenged by natural forces rather than being sheltered from them. The mighty world only becomes available through direct engagement with what others might consider hostile conditions. Cadet Kael'tha, who had been granted special permission to audit the class, raised his hand tentatively. "Professor, does this relate to what you mentioned about your grandmother's gardening?" "Precisely." Julia turned to write another quote on the board. "My grandmother always said that the most beautiful flowers grew in the most challenging soil." She wasn't just talking about gardening. She was describing a fundamental principle of human adaptation. Through the classroom windows, construction crews could be seen building the Academy's new, human-standard environmental training facility. Early reports suggested that alien cadets were requiring psychological counseling just to observe the planned conditions from a safe distance. "Professor Cook," Zilax asked, reviewing his notes, "in your opinion, what would constitute genuinely challenging environmental conditions for human survival training?" Julia considered this thoughtfully. "Well, you'd want to start with something genuinely difficult. Perhaps a nice stable environment with consistent temperature, filtered air, and regulated atmospheric pressure." She smiled at the confused expressions around the room. Most humans find artificial environments much more challenging than natural ones. We're not really designed for that level of predictability. Her desk communicator chimed softly. "Professor Cook, this is General Vex Thule. The Galactic Environmental Warfare Division is requesting your consultation on a new training protocol development project." "Of course, General. Though I should mention that my expertise is really in comparative literature, not military training." "Professor, your comparative literature expertise has revolutionized our understanding of environmental adaptation. The Science Council has reclassified Earth as a high-challenge training world and is requesting permission to establish a research facility." Julia glanced at her class schedule. "I suppose that would be fine, as long as it doesn't interfere with finals week. Students get stressed enough during exams without additional distractions." After disconnecting, she turned back to her class. "Now, where were we? Ah, yes, Shelley's Ozymandias and the relationship between environmental persistence and human achievement." As she began writing on the whiteboard, Zilax leaned over to whisper to Kael'thas, "She's about to explain how humans accidentally immortalize themselves by simply existing in conditions that would erase most civilizations from memory." "Is that what the poem's about?" Kael'thas whispered back. "According to human literary tradition, apparently yes." Julia overheard and smiled. "Actually, gentlemen, that's exactly what it's about. The poem explores how human responses to environmental challenge create legacies that outlast the conditions that originally shaped them." She underlined a phrase on the board. "The desert sands couldn't eliminate the human need to create something lasting, even when everything else crumbles." She turned back to the class, chalk still in hand. "Which brings us to next week's assignment. A 5-page analysis of how any literary work demonstrates humanity's relationship with environmental adversity. And please remember, this is literature class, not survival training." Though, she added with a slight smile, "I'm beginning to think the distinction might be less clear than we originally assumed." Outside the window, the construction crew was installing warning signs around the new human standard facility in 17 different galactic languages. The most prominent sign, visible from Julia's classroom, read, "Caution. Human-level environmental conditions. Full protective gear required for all non-human personnel." Julia noticed Zilax photographing the sign and chuckled softly. "You know, Commander, if you're really interested in challenging environmental literature, you should try reading some Antarctic exploration narratives. Fascinating stuff about human adaptation under genuinely difficult conditions." More difficult than the trial chamber? Zilax asked hopefully. Oh my, yes. Antarctica in winter makes that chamber look like a resort hotel. Julia began erasing the whiteboard, preparing for her next class. Though I suppose that's a matter of perspective. After all, humans vacation there. The sound of 17 different species having simultaneous existential crises could be heard echoing from the new facility construction site, carried on what Julia would have described as a lovely afternoon breeze, and what the construction crew's environmental monitors were classifying as barely survivable atmospheric conditions. Class dismissed.